So as we were going through the back and forth between the Hamburg Bezdin and Rabbi Breslov's response to the Hamburg Bezdin, it made me want to look back at the first book, which is Nogat Tzedek, and that is a book that is edited or created by someone named Lieberman, he's seen as a reformer. But he writes, the three rabbis that he writes to for Tshuvot are really not, there's some argument in Jewish history, would we call them reformers or not? I mean, it's hard to, because these are, Orthodox rabbis that they're writing to. Obviously they're writing to rabbis who they think are going to be more open-minded than the rabbis of Hungary. That makes sense. But it made me want to look back to their Tshuvot and see, like, what did they say about, we know the Hamburg Bezdin is responding, and they're responding to what they see as a very dangerous movement in Judaism, a dangerous thing afoot. So it makes sense that they're, kind of putting their fists down, and whether they have to draw on mystical things or whether they have to draw on other things that might not be halakhically obvious, to say, listen, praying not in Hebrew is certainly forbidden. We see where they're coming from because they're responding. But the original book, in which this person Lieberman is writing to these three rabbis, and these three rabbis are not necessarily aware of what this new reform thing is. These rabbis, one of them is in Italy, and the reform is beginning in Germany, and the temple isn't even really built yet. So, there is some criticism that these three rabbis don't really know what they're getting into, that they don't really know what they're responding to. And obviously the Hamburg Bezdin knows exactly what it's responding to. It's Hamburg. And besides that, it's responding to this book and the dangers that it sees. So I wanted to step back and go back to the original book, because in a way that is going to be more pristine. It's going to be slightly less political. Number one, those rabbis are not in Germany that he's writing to. And number two, it's the first book, so it's not a response back or forth. So I wanted to look closer at those letters and see, what did they say about something like prayer in Hebrew versus in German. And we have looked at the first one in some depth. But what's interesting is that the first one that we looked at, which was the Rabbi of Verona, the questions that he answers, so that he was asked, are how many shuls are there in Verona? If are drushos, are sermons in Hebrew or in Italian? Is the prayer silent or just the repetition of the Amidah? Because one of the things I wanted to do in the Hamburg synagogue was to not have a silent Amidah. They don't want to have a silent Amidah. Why? Because I guess Christians probably don't have a silent Amidah, and it was seen as, backward, something like that. And of course, his answer is, of course, we have, the silent Amidah. Third question is about the organ. And then, he spends a lot of time on the organ question, right? Now, it doesn't seem that they asked him, can you pray in German? Which is interesting. He doesn't answer the question, can you pray in German? The organ, he's got a long halakhic response. I mean, we saw this. The other questions, he's like, yeah, we have the silent Amidah. Yes, sermons are in Italian, it sounds like. So that people know what we're saying. But it doesn't seem like he was asked the question of prayer in German. Now, I don't know if that's on purpose or not. Because in a way, that's the harder question, right? The organ one is sort of a technical question. prayer obviously you can do in German, and it seems like from the Shulchan Aruch, like it could even be public, but it'll feel different. I think it feels like something that is really, a tremendous change. And then the second letter, which we didn't really do, which is a longer letter. That was from Rabbi Rekanada, the first one. The second one is from a rabbi in Ered, which is in Hungary. His name is Rabbi Chorin. And so he says, these people have come to me. They're thoughtful people. He says good things about them. V'avinu lahem beit tefila muhudar. They want a betiferet. They want to build a big and beautiful synagogue. Aval binyan azehu stiras binyan. But this building is going to be a destructive building. Or he says, I've heard the criticism about you, and I'll speak to that. And these are the criticisms I've heard, that this is going to be a destructive building. So you can already see that he knows what's going on politically and maybe what side he's on. That they're going to pray their Psuke de Zimra in the language of their land, in German. They're going to have an instrument. And the criticisms are that they're forsaking the tradition. They are using an instrument, which we don't use. They are lotit godidu. They're splitting the community into different factions. They are getting rid of the silent prayer. And they it says, hey, we cry out on the sin of these people. They do whatever they want. They pray in Hebrew, but they're praying with Sephardic pronunciation. So he doesn't seem to be asked about prayer in German either. So it's interesting. The tshuvot are not really addressing that. Let's see. Actually, maybe he does. I think he's the biggest. I think he's sort of the most reformist among them. And then the third letter, I have to look at this a little closer, it's a very long letter. The third letter is from a rabbi who people argue about, Rabbi Moshe Kunitz. Many people argue that he is not a reformer. Some people argue that he sort of is. And let's look at his. He says, here are the questions that you've asked me, that you're creating this synagogue. And one, Shemispalim b'mivta Sfardi, they're going to pray with a Sephardic accent. Shatz matchil achagol Yisrael, take a batil v'kol ram, that they're not going to have a silent Amidah. Mizmorim Kamashir, and they're going to have an organ. So again, it seems like it could be that Lieberman is picking and choosing who he asks what questions to. It doesn't seem that he's asked the two more traditional rabbis about prayer in German. It seems like only Rabbi Chorin is asked about prayer in German. So that's not that surprising, because I think the prayer in German part is a lot more questionable, because once you have a whole synagogue that only prays in German, that feels like a church. That feels very different. So he writes here, he says the prayers of the Jewish people go up to the highest places, and he says, Mivta Ashkenazit. It's there are eight ways that Ashkenaz and Sfard differ, and he says, look, there are lots of communities that pray with the Sephardic, Sephardic lands obviously pray, and he seems to say there's nothing wrong with that. And then he says the silent prayer, where they had asked him, could they get rid of the silent Amidah? He says, it says in the Gemara in Sota, why did we establish the silent prayer? Biarnu, and I've explained it in my book Bar Yochai, and anyway, he says, every nation has silent prayer. And he says, keeping the silent prayer is not going to make us seem different. And he says, anyway, the Gemara says that the reason we have a silent prayer is so that people can't hear each other, and they don't hear each other confess their sins. And this is very important. So when it comes to, so it's interesting. They've printed this in this sort of reform book, but he does not seem to agree that you could get rid of the silent prayer. In fact, he says, keep the silent prayer. That's what he seems to say. It has an important reason. And he says, anyway, it doesn't make us look that different than the non-Jews. So he obviously realizes what their goal is here. And then with regard to the organ, which I think is the part that we read, so he separates, I think, between the organ on a weekday versus the organ on Shabbos. And you remember he had argued that we have a non-Jew put out the candles in shuls. That's very, very common. And we don't want to break through any boundaries, he says. And then he explains that he seems to say he seems to make the argument that you could use a non-Jew to play the organ on Shabbos if it's really going to help the prayer. And that is based on Shulchan Aruch. He says, I wouldn't fight against that. And then he says, you really need to pray every day and you have to have a minyan. And he says, Habituru b'karv shchenechem misaviv hanimtza beit. He says, is there a shul that's only open on Shabbos? It says every house of worship is open every day. And every nation goes to church, goes to whatever house of worship every day. And certainly we do. So you should do what is right in the eyes of God. And that will raise up your glory, right? So it's interesting. He's not really, it's interesting that they reprinted it, right? He basically says you need to stay open every day. He says you want to use an organ and that's going to help, that's fine. He says don't get rid of the silent Amidah. And he doesn't address prayer in German. He says if you want to pray in Sephardic, that's fine. But so it's interesting. I don't think they asked him about it because he's too traditional. I think that's why. I think the only person that addresses it of the three is Rabbi, the one who's less traditional. So I think that's interesting. I haven't really seen anybody directly write about this, but I think that what they're asking, how they're asking it. I mean, it doesn't seem like they've edited these letters to reprint them. I mean, they're reprinting things that don't totally agree with them, that don't totally agree with what they want to do. So that's good. I'll take a closer look at this middle letter that does seem to address the question of prayer in German and see what he says. He seems to be a bit more of a reformer. And then the second half of this book is Lieberman himself arguing these things. And I think maybe we could take a look at that because we've seen the Hamburg Besdin and we've seen Rabbi Breslau's response, and they're basically talking at cross purposes. Rabbi Breslau's talking halacha, and the Hamburg Besdin is talking, some halachic things, but is really talking about a much larger picture. And so I think looking back to this original book is going to be helpful because it once the argument begins, now it's an argument and it's polemics and it's fear, and so that's different. It's interesting. This Rabbi Horner is different than the other ones. He's more of a reformer. He writes like a poem to support Lieberman, the early reform. So I have to find out a little bit more about it. Okay. So it's a little confusing, but we'll figure it out. Have a good day.
Thank you.
You're welcome. The Verona rabbi. I don't think they asked him that question, though, did they?
I don't think so, and that's what I was wondering before I
Right. He mentioned
a little bit.
Well, let's go back.
That was an issue with the people that were responding, right? That there are several in one place, but
wait, I think he did mention that. Let's see.
I think he said there's Italian, there's Sephardic, and there's Ashkenazi.
He says, wait, they asked him about Verona. Oh no, here. Well, they just ask him, do you pray? Do you have silent prayer? And he says, of course. It's funny, the way they ask the questions is different. In other words, in this thing, he doesn't seem to know much about them at all, which makes sense. He's in Verona. And they basically asked him, they asked him pointed questions. How many shuls do you have in Verona? Is the speech in Italian or Hebrew? Is the prayer, do you say the silent Amidah? And he just answers all things. And then is the organ okay?
All right.
And they basically look, so they're asking the question in different ways, I think.
Yeah,
we don't have the original letter, the original question that's written to these folks, but wouldn't be surprised if they targeted it in the right ways.
Yeah, I was curious to look up what they did with Solomon Rossi and his synagogue music a few centuries earlier.
Wait, who's that?
Solomon Rossi was an Italian Jewish composer that wrote actually Renaissance type pieces for the Italian synagogues.
Really?
Yeah, and this was in Mantua. But I realized too, how did they allow it? Then I looked up the source who allowed it, and they said he was an outlier.
And was there an instrument?
I think so. I didn't read that far, but his choral style is certainly like the Renaissance choral styles. It's not, it's all novel music.
And it's early, right?
It's 16.
Very early.
Yeah, Rossi, first name Solomon.
Yeah, I see him. That's interesting. He published a collection of Jewish liturgical music. In Hebrew, I guess. I mean, it's Hebrew songs, it's Hebrew words, right? But he's using, for his period, more modern tunes. Is that the idea?
Well, it's his own tunes, but the style of the tunes is,
yeah.
You listen to it, it sounds like, church choral music.
But do we know if they used it in the?
I think they did. Yeah, I remember reading at some point that at some places they did use it, but at some point, and I think it might have used an organ too. But again, he was an outlier, and
right. I mean, that's the thing. It's a different, obviously once you have a reform movement, it's slightly different. There's something more to respond to. I see there's a lot written about this. PhD thesis and other things. It's interesting though. It's its attempt to sort of refine what's going on in the synagogue to make it more like, you know, make it feel more noble for its time. Yeah, that's interesting. Huh. Okay.
All right, have a good day.
You're
Thank you.
welcome to.